I don't know. I don't know if y'all like to have a something up, a placeholder or anything.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Lunch and Learn on partnerships with Hemlock Restoration Initiative and SAHC. And I see folks are coming into the webinar, so we will give it another minute or two and make sure everybody's able to join, and then we'll get started. Looks like some more people are still joining. We'll just give it another minute or two. It looks like it's just a minute before noon. See the number of participants going up, so we'll just give it another minute.
We need some easy listening music, some entry music for folks.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm Carl Silverstein with the Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy, and we want to welcome you to Lunch and Learn today about Hemlocks and Hemlock Restoration Initiative and Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy's partnership with HRI on restoration. And we're thrilled to have three panelists today presenting on this topic. And Thom Green works with the Hemlock Restoration Initiative. And Thom grew up in the Pacific Northwest and has been living in these mountains since 2014 and has been doing outreach with Hemlock Restoration Initiative. And also want to introduce Stephanie and Sarah. Stephanie Long is an AmeriCorps program member working in stewardship with Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy and is in year 2 of doing that with us. And Sarah Sussman is also working with SAHC in stewardship of our land and conservation easements. And she previously served with Conserving Carolina as an AmeriCorps program member. So we're really proud of this partnership with HRI, and it is an example of how we work with others to achieve important conservation goals. And so I'll go ahead and turn it over to Thom.
Great, thank you, Carl. Let me go ahead and bring up my screen here. Is that looking good?
Yeah, you're looking good.
Great. Yeah, well, I'm excited doing this program today. HRI has a long history of working with SAHC. Actually, kind of even before we began, our director, Margot Wellston, was an AmeriCorps member with SAHC. I won't say how many years ago, but and so yeah, so she has she's been fostering that relationship since the very early days of HRI, and I'm excited to feature that relationship and tell you all a little bit about Hemlocks and what we're doing to work on that. So I'm going to give a quick overview of what we'll talk about today. I'll talk a little bit about HRI and what we do. I'm going to cover the importance of hemlocks in our ecosystem and the threat they're facing from hemlock woolly adelgid. I'll touch on some of our management approaches and the integrated pest management or IPM strategy that we're using. I'll talk a little bit briefly about resources we have for folks to protect their own trees and ways they can get involved before Sarah and Stephanie talk in detail about some of the partnerships that HRI and SAHC have worked on. And hopefully we'll have plenty of time at the end for lots of great questions. So people be thinking of those. So just to give a broad overview of what we're talking about, hemlock trees, the genus Tsuga, are a very important tree. We call them a foundation species in the places they're living. They're facing a threat from a non-native invasive insect called the Hemlock woolly adelgid. And that has led to a major forest health issue from the huge level of mortality we've seen across the range of hemlocks in eastern North America. So HRI, as I'll probably call us throughout the whole presentation, is a program of the nonprofit WNC Communities, which is based in Asheville and has led and developed a number of projects and initiatives over the years since 1946, actually. And you probably haven't heard the name WNC Communities before, but I'm sure you've seen many of the projects and programs they've worked on. There's just a small sampling of the range there on the right. And HRI is actually one of WNC Community's newer programs. We started in 2014 at the push or the initiative of the Commissioner of Agriculture, Steve Troxler. One of his staff members came out to Western North Carolina and saw some of the work being done by one of our partners who's researching genetics, genetic resistance, and went back, talked to the commissioner, and Commissioner got very excited and wanted to put some money towards protecting hemlocks in North Carolina. So that's how we got started. So our funding comes from a few sources. We have grants from the U.S. Forest Service and through the Department of Agriculture from the state of North Carolina. And then also we work with the North Carolina Forest Service through those grants. And then we also have funding from some other grants through private foundations, local governments, as well as individual folks giving donations. And HRI's mission is really to create a strategic plan that will ensure that our native eastern and Carolina hemlocks in the state can withstand the Hemlock woolly adelgid and survive to maturity across the landscape, both on public and private lands. And HRI actually kind of serves dual roles. We do on-the-ground management work, which I'll talk a little bit about, but then we also do a great deal of education and outreach to the public, raising awareness and giving people tools to take action. So to accomplish that mission, we have a few objectives. First, we have identified and continue to identify and establish hemlock conservation areas, we call them. So these are areas with very important hemlock component. And then on those hemlock conservation areas, or HCAs, we have been working to increase the number of trees being chemically treated on those public and privately conserved lands. We are also implementing biological control as a long-term strategy to be integrated with other strategies, including chemical control and some other strategies that are being developed and researched. So we support partners who are working on that, and I'll touch on those folks towards the end. And then we also, like I mentioned, do a lot of education, particularly educating folks on how they can protect their trees in an economic and efficient way on their own properties. And so I like to throw up this slide. It's a little overwhelming at first, but really HRI could only do what we do through partnerships and through collaboration. You see a host of logos here from state, federal agencies, nonprofits, land trusts like SAHC, academic and research organizations, just a host of partnerships that have really allowed us to do what we do and for us to support people and organizations in what they're doing for hemlocks. So to talk a little bit about hemlocks, these are some photos from various hemlock conservation areas. You'll notice that a number of these involve hemlocks near water. They play an important part in streamside, but also on bluffs where Carolina hemlocks live as well. There are species associated with hemlocks like this called pirate bush. And then hemlocks can grow to be very large trees, over 150 feet tall, live for hundreds of years, one of the longest lived and largest trees in eastern North America. This is actually one of the last surviving giants. It's the largest hemlock currently, which grows in Macon County on protected land there, Macon County, North Carolina. So the hemlock, the two species that we have here are eastern hemlocks and Carolina hemlocks. On the left, you can see their ranges across the East Coast. So Carolina hemlock is that dark green. It just has a very small range in the Southern Appalachians. It's just endemic to our area. But eastern hemlock has quite a large range. It stretches all the way down from Georgia and Alabama up into Canada, Nova Scotia, and Ontario, and then also as far west as Wisconsin, even dipping a little bit into Minnesota. In North Carolina, you can see the range of eastern and Carolina overlap quite a bit, and mostly is confined to our mountain area. So this is a very important tree for our mountain ecosystems, and really without action, maybe facing its end. So why are these trees so important? Why are Carolina and eastern hemlocks so important? Well, really it's because where hemlocks are found, they're what we call a foundation species. They really drive the ecosystems. So they affect everything from food webs to the hydrology. I'll pause for a second and talk a little bit about this because hemlocks, one of their largest values in our headwater streams is helping water quality, controlling stream temperature, keeping erosion under control, keeping just the water clean and clear for the macroinvertebrates, and then eventually for the trout. And trout fishing is huge recreation value here in Western North Carolina. So there's huge impacts just from the hydrology. They also have a huge influence on the structure, being one of the largest and longest lived trees where they're found. They affect the nutrient cycling, both carbon and nitrogen cycling in the forest. And because they create such a dense tree canopy when they're healthy, they have their own unique microclimate that is different from that of the surrounding trees, typically here found with mixed hardwoods, maybe some other pines and things. But because of how they grow, they create a microclimate different from the surrounding forest. So all of that leads to and contributes to the biodiversity found in hemlock stands and hemlock forests. So when we're talking about saving the hemlocks, we're not talking about just a couple of tree species, but really supporting and maintaining the ecosystems that these trees are responsible for driving. And no other tree in eastern North America can fill this niche. There's even been trials and research on replacing the hemlocks with something else, and no other tree, no other conifer in particular, can really fill that niche. So the threat that the hemlock is facing is a little bug called the hemlock woolly adelgid. So here are some pictures of various stages and forms, everything from an electron microscope photo over on the left to what you all are probably most familiar with on the right. That's what it's looking like this time of year. And this is really the single greatest threat to our hemlock health. There are some other things, some other pests and diseases that that occur on hemlocks, but really HWA is that greatest threat that we need to address. I want to talk a little bit about their life cycle real quick. So this is the life cycle over the course of a year. And I want to point out that hemlock woolly adelgid actually has 2 generations in a year. So this little bug, it's a piercing, sucking insect. It's actually native to the other areas where hemlocks are native on the west coast of North America and In Asia, there are 8 other hemlock species where hemlock woolly adelgid is native. But here in eastern North America, it's not native, and when it gets on our hemlock trees, it really causes havoc. So just talking about its life stages, it starts out as a little crawler, and that's really the only mobile stage of the hemlock woolly adelgid's life. It'll settle at the base of a needle. In the summer, it has a dormant period. Then in the fall, as it cools off, it comes out of that dormant period called estivation, and then starts to go through its nymphal stages, eventually becoming an adult right about this time of year and laying its eggs. I think I've even seen some eggs out there in the woods now. Those eggs are going to hatch, and then in the spring, it'll have a very fast and short generation where it doesn't go through a dormancy. Then it'll eventually lay its eggs in the summer, which will hatch, and then it'll go through that all over again. And the life cycle is important for what I'm going to talk about later with the biological control. So how does this tiny little bug kill these massive trees? Well, as I mentioned, I don't think I mentioned this on the previous slide. All of the adelgid we see in eastern North America are female, and they reproduce asexually on the tree. So every one of those little fluff balls is actually an egg sac. And so each of those females can be laying dozens or hundreds of eggs. And because of those 2 generations a year and all of those females reproducing, the populations can really explode. They don't have any focused co-evolved predators here in eastern North America. There are a few things that'll snack on adelgid, but nothing that focuses on it and is tied to its life cycle. There isn't competition from other insects that fill that niche on hemlocks. And it can be really, when it's in that crawler stage, dispersed in all kinds of ways. So it can be carried by wind, just blowing around like little dust particles. It can get onto birds and other animals. Birds are really a common way of it spreading quickly and jumping its range miles and miles at a time. And humans spread it around too. So the primary way we do this is by moving trees around. So that's actually how it was thought to be brought here to eastern North America in the first place. It was identified in Virginia in 1951, but was thought to be brought here decades before that on a Japanese hemlock that was planted in a special garden. So we move it around as well. Hemlocks are an abundant host as well. So those little crawlers can spread around on hemlock crowns that are touching, especially in areas like the Smokies where hemlocks are very dense. There also wasn't early action or regulation. I mentioned it was identified first in the 50s, but it really didn't start causing problems until about the 80s as a forest health issue. And what they do to destroy the tree is they put their little mouth part into the base of the needle and down into the wood. And that piercing and feeding action actually causes the tree to react in a way that disrupts the water flow. And so the tree acts like it's almost in a drought and starts to shut down needles and eventually loses so many needles that the tree dies. And folks might be familiar with watching an infested hemlock kind of thin out over time. And trees can really die fast, especially the largest trees, just in a matter of a few years. But trees can hang on, hemlocks can hang on for a number of years, just kind of limping along before they finally die. So this all leads to lots of mortality and really destruction on a landscape level. So these pictures might not be new to some of the folks, but it can be quite striking to see an area where a lot of especially the largest hemlocks have died. So what we as HRI and others are working on to combat the problem of hemlock woolly adelgid is what we call an integrated pest management strategy or integrated pest management approach. And so this involves using what I like to call all the tools in the toolbox. So that includes things like chemical control and chemical treatment, also biological control mostly with predators of hemlock woolly adelgid where the adelgid's native. Also conserving the genetic diversity of hemlocks through seed banking and seed orchards. And also research into forest management or silvicultural techniques to reduce the stress on the trees. And then also breeding potentially resistant hemlock for reforestation. And so really, it's going to take all of these strategies combined, working in concert to make a difference and eventually lead to the long-term survival of hemlocks. So first I want to touch on chemical control for a minute. Like I mentioned before, one of our objectives as HRI is to increase the number of trees, of hemlocks being treated on public lands and also privately conserved lands. And we work with a lot of partners on this. Our state level partners in North Carolina are the Forest Service, the State Parks, and the Wildlife Resource Commission. And we do this with volunteers, with hired crews, also with a program called Bridge, which is through the NC Forest Service and Department of Corrections. And so in these efforts since HRI started, we've actually been able to treat over 100,000 trees just since 2016. And this is exponentially over what had been treated in the previous about 7 or 8 years on state lands in North Carolina. So when I talk about chemical treatment, I'm talking about insecticides. So mostly we use systemic insecticides. So I like to think about these kind of where and how they're applied to the tree. So with a systemic insecticide, you can apply that to, oh, I think something is wrong with my slide here. There we go. So you can apply that to the soil and be taken up into the tree, or apply it to the trunk. So with the soil, you can inject it below the surface of the soil or pour it on the surface of the mineral soil if you scrape away the leaf litter. There's also tablets called Cortect, which are a new product that you can use and put those under the surface of the soil. You can also apply the chemical to the trunk of the tree, either by injecting it into the wood or spraying it on the bark, and it'll be absorbed into the tree that way, and then moved up through the vascular system of the tree out into those branches and twigs where the hemlock woolly adelgid is feeding. There are also horticultural oils. Oh, I really did something here. Oh, there we go. I pressed the wrong direction. There are also horticultural oils and insecticidal soaps that can be used as a contact insecticide, as a foliar spray, but this really only works if you can cover the whole tree. So it can work on trees or hedges that are kept small, but is not a long-lasting treatment or treatment for large trees, really. So there are some upsides to chemical control. We know that it's a reliable method for protecting an individual tree from hemlock woolly adelgid. It's fairly easy to acquire and apply these products, either as an organization or a state agency, or even as a private landowner. Or you can hire somebody to do that as well. It's fairly easy. It's much cheaper to treat a hemlock than to have it removed. And these treatments do last, the systemic treatments at least, last a number of years. They don't have to be done on a yearly basis for the systemics. Just a few updates about chemical treatment that may be news to some folks. There are generic imidacloprid products now. Imidacloprid is the primary systemic insecticide we use. And that has made the treatment much less expensive. It's about 1/10 the cost it used to be to treat a hemlock. And research is showing that imidacloprid can last for a number of years, up to 7 years in the tree, protecting it from hemlock woolly adelgid. There's also optimized dosing guidelines for imidacloprid, reducing the overall amount that we need to use on hemlocks. That's optimized just for hemlock trees and based on its diameter. And then I mentioned Cortect before, and that's a product that is very portable, easy to take up into the backwoods, and also easy to treat very small trees. Just pop a couple tablets into the tree, into the ground at the base of the tree, and it can be very fast and easy for small trees. There are some downsides to chemical treatment. We know that it is a short-term approach and really is just being used as a stopgap measure to keep what we still have on the landscape alive for these other longer-term strategies to kick in and take effect. It must be done on a tree-by-tree basis, and there is cost to that, so it can be very time and labor-intensive as well as financially intensive. And with any insecticide, there's a risk for off-target exposure. And I do want to take a second to address that off-target exposure. So the systemic products we use are neonicotinoids. That may be a familiar term for some folks. And so an insecticide really is anything you use, even even those contact insecticides and neem oil are all insecticides. So that's a chemical that is used to kill some kind of insect. And whenever you use an insecticide, you have that risk of off-target exposure. And so that's basically when we say off-target, that's just something that is not the hemlock woolly adelgid. It's not what we are going for. So when we talk about that risk of non-target impacts or off-target exposure, it really has to do with the hazard of your insecticide and how much exposure there is to that off-target organism. And so you can think about that risk being made up like a little math problem. If you have a large hazard times a large exposure, you get a pretty big risk. If your hazard is small, if your product or your chemical is a small hazard, but you still have a large exposure, then you have a moderate level of risk there. If something is a very small hazard and you get a limited exposure, then you have a much more minimal risk. So what does this mean for risk to pollinators with hemlock treatment? Well, really how you are using and applying these chemical products are the key to your off-target exposures. And so we have best management practices we use to limit that movement in the environment. Also, hemlocks are wind pollinated, which helps reduce that interaction with the insects and the tree. Hemlocks also don't produce as much resin as some other conifers, so some insects will use resins from trees. So overall, we expect pretty low risk from careful use of these insecticides. So looking at that math problem for hemlock treatment, we have a pretty big risk from the neonicotinoids, but if we can limit that exposure, that will help reduce the risk. And I like to make the point that there is a body of research that shows that more insects are going to be negatively impacted by the overall loss of hemlocks and the hemlock habitat than are likely to be affected by these targeted and low-dose treatments. So we're not talking about a no-risk, I'm losing some, there we go, I think I'm going too fast. So we're not talking about a no-risk approach, but a low-risk approach. So anytime we have a management decision to make, that's going to involve a trade-off, right? Choosing between two things and trying to offset those things. So for us, it's really, we're going to take a look at the costs and benefits of different approaches and different chemical treatment strategies. And then whatever we decide to do, we're going to try and minimize that risk. All right, I want to talk a little bit about biocontrol too. This is a very exciting topic for folks. So with biological control of hemlock woolly adelgid, it's mostly involved predators. And so this really means establishing a natural predator-prey cycle that doesn't currently exist with hemlock woolly adelgid in eastern North America, but does exist in areas where HWA is native. So when we're looking at a biocontrol agent, when we're researching and evaluating these, there's a few things we're looking for. We want to make sure it's very specific to the host. So the host in this case is hemlock woolly adelgid. We don't want it eating things that it shouldn't be eating. We want to make sure it's going to eat a lot of that HWA and reproduce well on its own. We also want to make sure it can search out new areas and new hemlocks and new hemlock woolly adelgid to feed on without our help of moving it around a lot. We also want to make sure that the life cycle of our biocontrol agent is synchronized with the adelgid life cycle, and that biocontrol agent is going to feed on as many life stages as possible. And because hemlocks have such a wide range in the east, we want to make sure that our biocontrol agents are also adapted to that range of climate conditions. And this is a federally regulated process that does take quite a while. It can take up to a decade from when a biocontrol agent is first started to be researched and looked at in quarantine facilities until it can actually be used out in the forest. So this is a slide of just a few of the biocontrol agents that have been approved. There's a few different species of beetle and also a species of fly. So the Laricobius nigrinus beetle is from the Pacific Northwest, and its relative, the Laricobius osakensis beetle, is from southern Japan, where we believe our strain of adelgid came from originally. Also native to Japan is the SAHC, or Sasagus skimnus suge beetle. And then the silverfly is also from the Pacific Northwest, where Laricobius nigrinus is from. But there have been a number of other biocontrol agents, insects, but also even one fungal species that have been tested but not ultimately pursued. So not everything that the scientists think might be a useful tool eventually becomes used in the woods. So touching a little bit on a couple of these, I want to talk about Laricobius for a second. This is the predator that we have worked with at HRI the most. And Laricobius, the life cycle here, you can kind of see those months up at the top. It primarily is feeding on the adelgid through the wintertime and then laying its eggs in the late winter, early spring, when its larvae will hatch, and then it lays its eggs right in the egg sac of the adelgid, that little fluff ball. And so when the Laricobius larvae hatch in that egg sac, they just start going to town feeding on adelgid eggs. And they also eat the crawlers too. But about mid-spring, around May or so, the Laricobius larvae drop into the soil. And so we still have a chunk of the adelgid life cycle, including most of that short generation, which is not controlled by the Laricobius. So really what this means is Larry's not going to do it all by himself. He needs some backup. But the good thing about Laricobius is we know that it's established. We recover it pretty much anywhere we're looking for it these days. We're often finding at least a few beetles, if not dozens. And we're finding them far away from where we've released them. So currently there's still studies underway seeing what level of impact the beetles are having on the adelgid population and if they are controlling it enough to affect hemlock health. So like I mentioned, Larry's probably not going to be able to do it all by itself. That's where the silverfly comes in. So the silverfly is kind of the new kid on the block. It's just being started to be used as a management tool. It's gone through all the research and approval process. And so the silverfly, or Leucotoraxis is the genus, it feeds on, its larvae feed on the adelgid eggs, and it covers basically all of those life stages, all of those, both of those generations of the adelgid, including where Laricobius is in the soil in the summer. So it's not, I like to make the point that it's not going to be one single predator that can take care of this whole problem. Like in the areas where adelgid is native, it's going to take a community of predators to keep the adelgid population under control. I want to wrap up here in a minute, but I do want to just mention that there are other strategies being researched, including preserving the genetic diversity of hemlocks through seed banks and seed orchards. There's also research going on, like I mentioned, on breeding resistant hemlocks. So one of our partners, the Forest Restoration Alliance here in North Carolina, is working on that, along with some folks in other states. And then there's research going on with U.S. Forest Service Southern Research Station in an organization called CamCorps, who's also doing that seed banking, to look at silvicultural techniques, in particular exposing hemlocks to more light and seeing if that helps reduce the stress from the adelgid. So some of these are the other strategies that are being researched and pursued that we help support our partners on. So real quick, I'm going to fly through this so we have lots of time for questions, but there are some resources that we have available to folks on our website. We have materials that folks can look at, instructional and informational materials, including a video on how to treat your trees. And all of that's on our website. We offer trainings for folks and technical advice if you have questions. And we are also working with organizations and communities to do cost and work share programs to help support them in economically treating their trees. So please reach out to us. So some ways you can help before we talk a little bit about the HRI SAHC partnerships. I'll just run through these. You can take a look at your trees, treat them if you're able, or just monitor them to make sure they're not declining in health if they're still looking good. You can come out and help us on a Workday, including one that we have coming up with SAHC, but check our website for those. We also do educational hikes and trainings and other events that you're welcome to join us. And just spreading the word about hemlocks and hemlock woolly adelgid helps address the issue. There are some folks who still aren't aware, maybe they're new to the area and they're not aware of this problem. You can also be an advocate for hemlocks and support the state and federal efforts to control hemlock woolly adelgid. HRI, like I said, is a nonprofit program, so you can donate to our parent organization, WNC Communities, if you'd like. And please check out our website, and you can follow us on social media as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah and Stephanie now.
Thanks, Tom. That was a great overview. And before we focus on the partnership with SHC and some of our properties, I just wanted to refer to the question. It's in the Q&A from somebody on the Tennessee side of the line asking about whether there's some partnership opportunities in Tennessee. I think they're at a educational institution over there and was interested in whether things are happening in Tennessee as well.
Yeah, so actually one of the folks working a lot on biological control, or one of the institutions, is UT Knoxville. So I'm not sure if that's the school you're associated with there, but there is quite an effort in Tennessee, both through their Division of Forestry to do hemlock treatment with what they call their strike team, which is kind of a similar model we follow with our public land treatment. So the Division of Forestry is working on the chemical treatment and also integrating the biocontrol. And then, yeah, the UT Knoxville has been a hub for Laricobius research in particular. But yeah, I'd be glad to connect with Adam about what's going on and learn what your school is and you know who we can connect you with in Tennessee, or ways we can facilitate that communication.
Great. And you may see the second question there about theory. If some trees can be protected in an island, eventually the bugs move too far away to get back. And then the island can spread. So wondering if that is a good theory. And everybody else on the Lunch and Learn, please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A or the chat, and then we'll probably move on and then have some time at the end for the next questions.
Yeah, should I address Paul's question right now, or?
Sure.
Yeah, so I haven't actually heard of this myself, but I can see how it would work in theory. With hemlocks, unfortunately, you would really need either all of the hemlocks to be treated or die to create that island where the adelgid moves away. We're not to that point yet. And actually, I don't know if we want to get to that point. So with our HCAs, we are trying to create dedicated areas where we're first chemically protecting and then also using biocontrol. But really, the HWA is here to stay, and it's a matter of managing it to a level where the hemlocks can survive and withstand the adelgid, you know, as part of the ecosystem now. But I'll have to look into that. I haven't heard of that before.
Great, thanks, Tom. And we do have plenty of time for questions, I think, after we just have a short bit about highlighting some SHC properties, but we can get back to questions after that. So I'm just going to share my screen. The slideshow. All right, hopefully everybody can see that. So Sarah and I are going to highlight a few SHC protected properties where HRI has collaborated either with SHC to treat hemlocks on preserves or with private landowners to treat hemlocks on properties where SHC holds conservation easements. And these properties are seen here in red on this map, and they're shown across SHC's focus areas. So we're first going to start looking at fee simple properties, and starting in our Roan focus area, we have the Big Rock Creek Preserve and the Alcala Preserve, which are two SHC owned properties that have received hemlock treatment. So staff from SHC and HRI, as well as several volunteers, completed a workday on the Big Rock Creek Preserve, which we can see in the top left of the map, in 2018, where they chemically treated 100 trees on the preserve. And SHC and HRI staff also chemically treated 29 trees on the Alcala Preserve, which is a bit east or to the right on the map of the Big Rock Creek property. And so we treated 29 trees in 2020 chemically on that property. And GPS points were taken for each tree treated on both of the properties so that we can find these trees again and We can observe them for change over time as the properties are monitored and possibly, retreat if that is a possibility. And for a more in-depth look at the Elk Hollow Workday in particular, we do have a short YouTube video that Travis Borley put together that's up on the SHC YouTube channel if you're interested in checking it out. And then next, we're going to go to the French Broad River Valley focus area. So we're looking at the Sandy Mush Game Lands Norco Tract, which is seen on the right in the map. And it's currently owned by the state, but it was previously owned as a fee simple property by SHC before it was transferred to the state. And while it was under SHC ownership, SHC and HRI collaborated multiple times to treat hemlocks on the property through chemical treatments and also biological control. 300 Laricobius beetles were released in 2015 for biological control, and 130 trees were chemically treated across the Norco and other Sandy Mush Game Lands tracts over the course of 2 workdays in 2016. And our final fee simple property example, we're looking at the Laurel Ridge Preserve in the Black Mountains focus area. And there are Carolina hemlocks on this property. So in 2016, SHC and HRI completed a site visit to look for the presence of Laricobius beetles on the property. And that's what they're doing in these photos here, shaking the branches and then holding something underneath to look for beetles. So Laricobius beetles were previously released on a neighboring Asheville watershed property, and that's a property that's adjacent to the northern boundary of the Laurel Ridge Preserve. And during this 2016 site visit, it was confirmed that Laricobius beetles, presumably from that release, were present on Carolina hemlocks on the Laurel Ridge property, acting as a biological control. So treatment was not done directly on this property, but the hemlocks on this property benefited from treatment done nearby. And I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to talk about treatment done on some conservation easement properties, as well as our upcoming workday with HRI.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks, Thom, for that great overview. I learned a lot from that. I'm going to talk about 3 conservation easements that we have in the Black Mountains. First one is Ferguson Knob, which you can see in the southern portion of the Black Mountain focus area. And in 2016, HRI released 225 of those predatory beetles on that conservation easement property. And then at Montreat, HRI has been working with Montreat independently of SAHC, but SAHC introduced HRI and Montreat to each other. And HRI works with the town of Montreat and the Montreat Land Care Committee to take care of their hemlocks. And in 2015, HRI gave Montreat a grant to develop an integrated pest management plan. That's what Thom was talking about earlier. And that led to the chemical protections of 3 Carolina hemlock stands. There have been several beetle releases at Montreat, and there's an annual follow-up from HRI to observe any changes. And then finally at Christmount, HRI has worked with Christmount to release beetles in 2016 and 2017, and they're currently helping to develop a hemlock inventory and management plan with Christmount. And SHC loves that Christmount is taking care of their hemlocks on their property. And then next slide. So our upcoming Chestnut Workday is at the future Chestnut Mountain Park, which will be transferred to the town of Cannon this year, hopefully. SHC acquired it as a fee simple property in 2020. And right now, hiking and biking trails are under construction, along with a bike park. And currently it's not open to the public, but in the future it will be whenever the town of Cannon acquires it. Our workday is on February 18th all day. And right now we are currently full, but you can join the wait list. There's a link on our website to sign up for it. And there are just some pictures of me doing my first hemlock treatment with HRI, which is pretty cool.
I'll jump in. I remember working with Sarah on that day.
Yeah.
That was at Grandfather Mountain, right?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
It was really fun. And that's all I have. We have some more questions.
Yeah, and can I throw in one more thing? Just some just context and exciting tidbits. So that Norco Tract, those Norco Tract workdays in 2016 were the very first volunteer treatment days that HRI did in our existence. So that's very exciting to see that and think back to those areas. And then with that Norco Tract, and similarly with the Chestnut Mountain site, it's great to see SAHC and HRI to be able to partner to protect the hemlocks on those areas before they're then transferred to be public lands. And so that partnership really allows for that, that long-term benefit to the public through those transfers. I just want to throw in those couple things, but I'm ready for questions if y'all are.
Well, thank you, Stephanie and Sarah and Thom. And I want to thank again everybody who's joined this Lunch and Learn to learn more about hemlocks and hemlock restoration efforts. A couple of questions have come in. One was about whether individual trees that have been treated are marked for that. And I think Stephanie alluded to that. And others may want to chime in there about kind of learning and documenting where the trees are that have been treated.
Yeah, I'll jump in. We do a couple things, and it's really up to the landowner and what they want to do, including the agencies we work with. So out in the woods, kind of on the ground, we will often paint the trees to know both in that day which ones we treated and didn't treat, but then coming back, if the paint lasts long enough, we can see which trees were treated. And then for data as well, we often will take GPS points for those trees, not necessarily to pinpoint the exact location as much as to see on a map kind of where the concentration of those trees are in an area, because the hemlocks can be, even in a few acre area, can be quite scattered or clumped. So those are the kinds of marking and record keeping we keep on those.
Great, thanks.
Can I jump in as well to answer that,
Margo,
to follow up on that question?
Yourself?
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Margo Walston, and I'm the director of the Hemlock Restoration Initiative. And as Thom mentioned at the beginning, I'm so thrilled to be here on this Lunch and Learn because I have such a fondness in my heart for SAHC and for my time there. And Thom didn't want to mention it, but it's been a solid 10 years plus since I was serving as a stewardship associate through the AmeriCorps program. So I wanted to touch on the first question that was asked about the marking your trees, and just to let everyone know that, as Thom mentioned, biological control is also considered a treatment method. And so biological control, it's actually particularly important to take records and mark and report the locations of those activities. And we do that using a big database that is managed by Virginia Tech. And so that's something that anyone who is involved with biological control for hemlock woolly adelgid is and should be contributing to.
Thanks, Margo. And I want to recognize you for your work with hemlocks. And one of the things that we're especially proud of with the AmeriCorps program is how former associates go off all over the world and certainly all over the country and contribute significantly to conservation. And so seeing how this Hemlock Restoration Initiative has grown and feeling like we were working with you earlier in your career really makes a big difference to us too. And I know it makes a big difference to conservation in the Southern Appalachians. So thank you.
Yeah, sure, of course. And I didn't stray as far as others may have. I've stayed put here. But I will also mention, because I love this story, that the Norco tract in particular was a tract that I first got to know when it was acquired by SAHC, and I was responsible for walking through it and doing a present conditions report, like a baseline report. And I saw these massive hemlocks down in the steep on the boundaries of the property. And I hadn't seen healthy hemlocks in that part, in Buncombe County very often. And so I was super excited, and remember going back to Hani and mentioning that these trees were there. And it took years. I didn't know we'd ever go back, but when the Hemlock Restoration Initiative started, we made our way back there for sure. And we've now found thousands and thousands of trees all throughout the Sandy Mush game lands and along Turkey Creek and Sandy Mush Creek that we've been able to go in and work to turn into hemlock conservation areas. And our technicians were just out at the Norco tract couple weeks ago, and they said that the trees out there are looking great, which is really exciting. So, and we've recovered beetles and other sites where we've released them in the sandy mush game land. So it's a really great story that all started with SAHC.
It sure is. It's good to have a story like that to feel positive about. It's just, it is great news. We've had a couple of other questions come in, and one of those you can see is whether there's a chance that predator bugs can cause unforeseen issues in other trees.
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's something that really goes into that research phase that can take a decade or more, like I mentioned before. So part of that is evaluating what those HWA predators do on other organisms. And so with Laricobius in particular, both of those Laricobius species, their life cycle is tied to Hemlock woolly adelgid. I believe they will feed on other adelgids. So in the Southern Appalachians, we have a native adelgid on pine trees. There's also the invasive balsam woolly adelgid. So adelgids are part of the landscape here besides Hemlock woolly adelgid. And I believe there's actually a native Laricobius. This is getting a little more into the weeds, but there's a native Laricobius that feeds on that and lives with that pine bark adelgid. And we do find that native Laricobius on hemlock trees occasionally, but clearly it didn't move over when Hemlock woolly adelgid arrived enough to control the adelgid. So the Laricobius we've introduced, the Nigrinus and Osakensis, they may go afield to the pine bark adelgid here or there, but they need the Hemlock woolly adelgid to complete their life cycle and lay their eggs in there. And so their populations should follow pretty closely the adelgid population cycles. And they're, if all the adelgid magically disappeared for some reason, the Laricobius would not move over to something else and be able to survive and cause problems for other things.
Thanks for that. Question whether HRI partners with Appalachian Trail Conservancy and if there's potential to treat trees within the AT corridor.
Margaret,
I can take a stab at that. Yeah, we have not had a project directly with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, but we are familiar and friendly with them, and actually helped do some ash treatments just to be able to share different type of treatment methodology and learn from them as well. So there's the opportunity, if there were a need, for us to collaborate with them. And so I don't think that there's been a identified project at this point, but if you know of anything, then please reach out to us and we can pursue that.
Cool. Also a question about whether there's a minimum percentage of hemlocks that have to be treated in order to maintain the community.
I don't know if there's been any hard research on, the amount of canopy cover or the number of trees of a certain size that need to be there. I mean, hemlocks in the Southern Appalachians in particular are very patchy and can be concentrated in certain areas, particularly around those stream sides and riparian areas. And so, my understanding is it's more about where the patches are and preserving enough trees in those patches. And so because they're not sort of uniformly spread across the landscape the way you might see maple or even like tulip poplar kind of all over the place, depending on the forest type. With hemlocks, it's they're fairly clumpy and they kind of tend to stick together to create those ecosystem impacts, like I was mentioning. So I don't know in terms of a percentage or how much you want to keep. Really, to have like the microclimate impact, you do need several trees together in an area. And that's kind of how we focus our treatments, is finding those hemlock conservation areas and then targeting targeting the trees in the densest parts of those state lands and public lands or areas like SAHC properties, and not necessarily kind of wandering far afield from those concentrated areas. Although, if we see a hemlock in the area we're treating, then we'll consider it as, part of that HCA.
And I'll add on to that hemlocks in the Southern Appalachians tend to be more dispersed than up further north in their range. So you will find them mixed and spread out in other deciduous stands or stands with pines as well. And they have a disproportionately large influence on that and on their environment, even in small numbers. So especially along those riparian corridors, even if you have a few trees, they might be playing a big role in that small micro ecosystem where they are.
Great, thanks. We have a couple of questions that are sort of related, and they relate to whether folks can be involved in efforts to treat hemlocks that are separate from necessarily a partnership Workday with HRI. There's a question whether you can create a small group to work within a state park or a public area that's kind of functioning on its own. And then there was another question in the chat from Hervin about whether a landowner homeowners association can get the predator beetles for release themselves, I guess.
Yeah, I might. Margaret, do you want to jump in, or do you want me to go?
Sure.
So I might address that predator beetle question first, and come back to the one about people getting out there and getting involved. So basically, with the biocontrol, the idea is that this is going to be a landscape level tool or approach, and so the work that HRI and other folks before us and in concert with us are doing for the biocontrols should lead to, like I like to say it this way, like you don't need to go get the beetles are going to come to you. And so ideally with our work on these, these public lands or conserved lands, the biocontrols are going to spread on their own. And with Laricobius, we see that. I mean, we go around Western North Carolina and look in kind of random places that we, aren't aware that there's been a release, even within miles of, and now after, maybe, a decade or more, probably more for Laricobius nigrinus, the Laricobius have spread very well. I mean, if you live in Asheville and you have a hemlock tree with Hemlock woolly adelgid, you might find a beetle on it. And so we don't really think that folks need to go out and try and, add to that population. With Laricobius in particular, you can't really buy them anywhere. You can't procure them anywhere. And there is one source for the SAHC beetle, but the beetles are expensive. And the other thing I like to say is that, just because you put some beetles on your tree doesn't mean they're going to stay on your tree. And so they have wings, they fly away. They're organisms, they do what they want. Life does what it wants. So really our objective is to implement the predators at a scale where they're going to come to those private lands on their own. And the silverfly will probably be a very similar story, where once it's being introduced to public lands and spreading out from the initial research areas and first introduction areas, it'll spread across the landscape in a way that folks won't have to worry about going out and procuring them. So I hope that answers Irvin's question. To jump back to the question from Connolly.
Can I jump in there, Thom?
Yeah, go for it, Margo.
So just again to reiterate that we're really excited about the current potential of predator beetles, especially the Laricobius that we have been working with. But the jury is still out as to how capable they are at maintaining the health of an individual tree or a stand. And so that is an important thing to keep in mind, that as they spread and as they're used as a piece of the control for hemlock woolly adelgid, that they are not going to at this time protect your tree from declining. So we have resources on our website for how you might go out and look to see if those predator beetles are already present in trees on your property. And that is the best thing right now that you can do to advance the biological control aspect of our program, is to monitor your trees, to know if you have predators there, to report that so that we're aware of how widespread they are, and also to monitor your tree's health so that you'll be able to determine whether your trees are continuing to decline even in the presence of predator beetles. So look, if you can't find that on our website, you're welcome to reach out to us and we'll direct you to those instructions for how to do that. And I wanted to jump in and try to answer Connolly's question about working in state parks or other public areas. So these treatments are available to you to use as a private landowner on your property or on properties where you have permission. But on our public lands, you would need to be coordinating with whoever is responsible for managing those lands. So you don't have to go through HRI, though we welcome you to join us as we work on various state parks and forests and game lands and all over the place. But if you wanted to, if there's another area and you want to speak to the landowners and land managers about things that you can do with them, then you would be able to work with them to establish what would be possible. Does that answer the question? And Thom, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just say that includes SAHC. So if you want to be involved with SAHC's hemlock efforts, stay tapped into them.
Thanks, y'all. And another question is whether there's an optimal time of year to apply chemical controls.
Sure, and I just want to not to take your job away, Carl. I just want to keep an eye on the clock. I can go on for a while, so but I will quickly say, basically, fall and spring are great. That's when the trees are moving the most water for systemic treatments. For contact insecticides, which I'll admit I don't know a ton about and we don't use as a tool ourselves, the timing depends on the life cycle of the adelgid. So that's a much longer answer, a little more detailed answer. But really, in our area, depending on a few environmental conditions, you can treat pretty much any time of year, but the spring and fall are the best. You just need to make sure it's not too wet, not too dry, too cold, or is going to rain more than an inch in the following day, we say within 24 hours. And so given all that, if it's not in a drought, if we're not going to have a prolonged dry period before or after treatment, and if the ground's not frozen, really any time of year is fine. But people tend to say that the spring and or the fall being the best based on the tree moving that chemical through it.
Thanks, Thom, and thanks for pointing out the time. We really have reached the end of our hour together, and we see that this is a popular topic. There's lots of questions coming in, and I think it would be great if Connolly and Thom, you and Margot can connect directly. And folks have asked about the Lunch and Learn being available to watch later, and SHC does have a YouTube channel, so we'll put it up on YouTube, and want to invite everybody to take a look at some of the other Lunch and Learns we've done, and also to tune in for our next one, which is going to be on March 2nd and is going to be Pollinators 101. So we appreciate everybody for joining in on this today, and thank you again, Margot and Thom, for an excellent presentation. And Stephanie and Sarah, thank you for outlining what SAHC does in partnership with HRI, and then for hosting the Workday that's coming up. We're grateful to everybody for all your work on this topic. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having us. We're glad to be involved.
We will look forward to seeing y'all again at our next webinar. So thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Great to keep the partnership going.